Good to see you. How are you doing? You keeping all right? Are you finding a way through these crazy times that we're living in? I hope you are. And I hope you have some people around you who are encouraging you and helping you with that. Somebody around you who's asking you once in a while how you're doing. I'm your pastor, so I have a particular privilege and responsibility to ask you how you're doing and to be thinking particularly of the care of your soul. So when I ask you how you're doing, I'm wondering about your life with God. I'm wondering about your journey with Jesus. I'm wondering, as the old song puts it, whether it's well with your soul. Since I haven't been able to see most of you for 6 months now, I'm wondering what effect this half year has had on you. In particular, I'm just wondering whether you're growing in God. Have you found a way of keeping company with Him in these circumstances that feels like being in a classroom and learning more from Him and about Him? That feels like being in a snug, sitting by a fire, where you feel you're growing closer to God and deeper with Him. Are you growing? That's what I want to think about with you this morning as we come back to this story of Abraham. We're going to notice 3 things in the passage we've read today. Abram's crisis, signs of growth, and then growth confirmed. So first of all, the crisis. We didn't read the opening verses of the chapter this morning, so let me give you a quick synopsis. I think if those opening verses were made into a film, you'd find that film in the action movie section. The action begins when 4 tyrannical eastern kings, they're probably from the region of Sumer, round about Ur of the Chaldeans, where the Abram story began. These 4 kings, under their captain-in-chief, Chedorlaomer, they form an alliance and they come to crush a revolt by 5 kings in the Dead Sea area. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are among the 5 defeated kings. It's a story that wouldn't mean anything to us, I don't think, unless, as happens in verse 12, we learn that the conquering kings carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. Then in verse 13, we learn that Abram hears news of Lot's capture. So here we have our crisis, and Abram's confronted with a dilemma. How's he going to respond? Before we look at Abram's response, let's remind ourselves very quickly about Lot. Last week in Genesis 13, we saw that Lot has taken advantage of Abram. When Abram had presented him with a choice, take your pick, the land where you want to settle, and I'll go the other way. What does Lot do? Without a thought for Abram's seniority, without even considering common courtesy, Lot takes advantage of Abram's kindness. The selfish pig chose the best land for himself. This is the Lot who's been kidnapped. Good riddance, you might say, if you were Abram. Serves you right for how you've treated me. Lot's clearly in great physical danger at this point in the narrative, but that isn't his only problem. He's also far from God. Paul showed us last week that to move eastward in the Genesis narratives invariably means to move away from God. For Lot, it's Sodom he's been moving towards. So in chapter 13, verse 11, when he chooses the fertile Jordan Valley instead of the promised land of Canaan, he's taken his first step that will eventually lead him into the wicked city of Sodom. Then again in chapter 13, verse 12, we read that he camps near Sodom. By verse 12 of chapter 14, our chapter, we know that he's living in Sodom. And by the time we get to the first verse of chapter 19, we see that Lot is sitting at the gateway in Sodom. That implies that he's become a respected leader in that community, that he has a seat on the local council of that corrupt city. Lot is living further and further and further away from God. So now Lot, this nephew who's taken advantage of Abraham, who's deliberately chosen to live far from God, he's in danger. What's Abraham going to do? Will we see any signs of Abram growing in these very real life circumstances in which he finds himself? Abram responds with grace and with courage in face of danger. He's growing all right. Do you remember Abram's twin failures back in chapter 12? He failed to believe that God would provide for him and his family, and that's why he took them from the land of promise down to Egypt. And he failed to believe that that God would protect him and his family. And so he resorted to deception. He risked his wife's honor and safety to the whim of Pharaoh. As we said back then, if life with God is about faith, then Abram's failing miserably. But we've seen signs already that Abram's changing, that he's growing. Abram's starting to believe that God will provide. Paul helped us to see this last week. Abram's no longer believing in the myth of scarcity, but he's rather getting to know the God of abundance. And he's learning to trust him, that he will provide. Today, here in chapter 14, we see another facet of Abram's growing trust in God. He's learning to trust God that he will protect. Look at verse 14. When he heard that his relative had been taken captive, Abram called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. We read in verse 16 that he recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. As soon as Abram hears that Lot's in trouble, he acts decisively to help him. At great inconvenience to himself, he acts to help Lot, who's taken advantage of him. He risks his life to rescue Lot, who is clearly far from God. He's able to do this because he's trusting God for protection. Friends, Abram really is showing signs of growing as a man of God. I think he's displaying the character of Jesus Christ. Abram helped Lot, who had taken advantage of him. And when he did so, he was living out what Jesus taught his disciples. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn your left cheek also. If someone forces you to go 1 mile with them, go 2 miles. Jesus' message is clear. Even when you're being taken advantage of, continue to deal in grace. Isn't that quite a lesson? Isn't that something each follower of Jesus Christ here this morning will want to take to heart? When a trusted friend proves unfaithful, we remain faithful. When there's a dispute in our family and we feel we've been let down, we hang in there and we look for ways to help and to bring restoration. Does that sound impossible? Good. Now we're beginning to realize that this requires utter reliance on God. We need His grace. This is no ordinary journey we're on. We need God's Spirit to transform us if we're ever going to display His character. Abram displayed the character of Jesus as he loved the one who had taken advantage of him. Abram also displayed the character of Jesus when he helped Lot, who was far from God. Jesus taught his disciples how to respond to those who don't yet know God. He told parables, explaining that his Father is seeking out these sorry souls, There's an eagerness and a determination. It's like a shepherd looking for a lost sheep, or like a woman who's lost her wedding ring, or like a father looking for his long-lost son. Jesus' own willingness to look for those who didn't yet love God earned him a nickname, friend of sinners. Isn't that another profound lesson for those of us learning to follow Jesus? That person in our workplace who swears incessantly and who mocks us for our commitment to Jesus, we don't write them off just because they're far from God. Our respectable, friendly, ever so pleasant neighbour who doesn't appear to have given God a thought for years, we don't give up on them either. When people are far from God, we do everything we can to seek them out and to help them. This is the way of Jesus. Abram's growing in it. So can we, if we'll be open to the Spirit of Jesus working in us. Let's pause there for a second and sing a song together. My heart is filled with thankfulness.